He wrote about the most essential things, for throughout his life, his quarrel was with tyranny, but also about everyday things, cartoons and cartoonists, daylight savings time, ocean liners, Moses, the Boy Scouts. He wondered, are there men on the moon? Or what he might do if he lived his life again. He traveled to America and wrote about the land of corn and lobsters, and as somebody reminded me, all the ice we put in our water, and the Civil War. He often called such articles his potboilers. And so they were, but possessed of soaring rhetoric and entertaining musings. And his work goes on with continuous posthumous publication, notably his complete speeches, 8 volumes, 9,000 pages. His collected works, 38 volumes, 19,000 pages, and Hillsdale's 18 volumes of Churchill documents within the official biography series, 10 million words, and still counting, for there are 5 more to come, at least 5 more. Almost uniquely, Winston Churchill was a statesman writer, not only the sole person to hold a high office in the 2 greatest cataclysms of the past century, but the only one to write deeply about them with a certain understandable personal bias. He always seemed to find the right words, and it's not too much to suggest that Britain survived in 1940 because it was led by a professional writer. At a time when there was little else to fight with, Churchill mobilized the English language, as Ed Murrow said, and sent it into battle. What he did not originate came from his knowledge of the classics, from the Bible to Shakespeare, and scores of great writers. As a young officer in India, he read the classic books, just as students do at Hillsdale, storing them in his capacious memory. Broadcasting in April 1941, just after the U.S. Congress had passed the Lend-Lease Act, he quoted a 19th century poet. And not by eastern windows only, when daylight comes in the light. In front, the sun climbs slow, how slowly, but westward look, the land is bright. Those lines are from Say Not the Struggle Naught Availeth by Arthur Hugh Clough. Today, if uttered by some candidate for president, they would be unknowable, however applicable, except perhaps here and at a few other places. But the 40s were another age. Bernard Darwin, editor of the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations, said Churchill didn't have to identify Clough as his source because in that more literate age, every English schoolchild knew it. Hearing those lines, we were, if possible, more sure than ever, Darwin said, that Mr. Churchill was the man for our money. And to quote Professor David Dilks, if you will allow that remark in parenthesis, ladies and gentlemen, do you not sometimes long for someone at the summit of our public life who can think and write at that level? Writing and statesmanship went hand in hand, for writing complemented Churchill's political aims. This is not history, he said of his war memoirs, this is my case. He knew how influential his words would be, however. It will be found much better by all parties to leave the past to history, he said in 1948, especially as I propose to write that history myself. His writing had a financial side. The salaries of members of parliament were low. To this day, they have cramped offices, few aides or interns. Though born to an American society beauty and the son of a duke, Churchill inherited no family wealth. He would later say, I kept my family by my pen, and I lived from mouth to hand. His pen was kept busy because he had expensive tastes. His friend F.E. Smith, Lord Birkenhead, said, Winston's tastes are simple. He's always quite prepared to put up with the best of everything. The best included silk underwear. I have a very sensitive cuticle, he told his shocked wife when she got the bills. The cigar bill running up to $200 a week in today's money. And though his drinking was vastly exaggerated, mostly by himself, vintage champagne and brandy. Chartwell, his beloved home in Kent, was a money pit, with a farm almost always in the red. He told his colleague, David Lloyd George, I'm going to make it pay whatever it costs. He was a born writer, a Harrow historian, found a dramatic article he wrote in 1889, aged 15, about an imagined invasion of Russia, a remarkably accurate forecast of what actually happened 25 years later. Young Winston even set the date, 1914, the year World War I would break upon Europe. I propose to tell you some but not all about his writing. It would take a semester. All his books are still readily available. Indeed, nowadays, more available than ever, for Rosetta Books has published most of his works as ebooks, as they did with Hillsdale's Churchill biography. So let us look at some of his most characteristic books to give you an idea of the depth of his imagination, his scholarship, his wonderfully entertaining writing, and its timeless relevance to our time. My Early Life, his autobiography of his first 30 years, is the book everyone should read first. It is now established that Churchill took liberties in it. For example, he was not so nearly ignored and abandoned by his parents as he implies. His nephew Peregrine showed me Lady Randolph's diaries, showing that she spent a remarkable amount of time with Winston and his brother Jack before they left for school. Winston was a very naughty boy, Peregrine said, and his parents were much concerned about him. My Early Life is a wonderful treat. One reviewer likened it to a beaker of champagne for its style and pace, its sense of adventure and self-deprecating humor, its ability to let the reader peer over our author's shoulder as events unfold. Of course, as William Manchester wrote, Churchill's youth was virtually incomprehensible to most people then alive. He had been born into the English aristocracy at a time when British noblemen were considered, and certainly considered themselves, little less than godlike, master of 1/4 of the earth's surface and population, thrice the size of the Roman Empire at full flush. They controlled Great Britain herself to an extent that would be inconceivable in any civilized nation today. 1% of the country's population, 33,000 people, owned 2/3 of the wealth. And that wealth, before 2 world wars devoured it, was breathtaking. My Early Life records that time and his adventures in it with words which will live as long as any 20th century author is read. 2 examples demonstrate. One is Churchill's recollection of his examination in mathematics, which is my favorite because I had similar experience. We were arrived in an Alice in Wonderland world, at the portals of which stood a quadratic equation. This, with a strange grimace, pointed the way to the theory of indices, which again handed on the intruder to the full rigors of the binomial theorem. Further dim chambers lighted by sullen, sulfurous fires were reputed to contain a dragon called the differential calculus. But this monster was beyond the bounds appointed by the civil service commissioners who regulated this stage of Pilgrim's heavy journey. We turned aside not indeed to the uplands of the delectable mountains, but into a strange corridor of things like anagrams and acoustics called sines, cosines, and tangents. Apparently they were very important, especially when multiplied by each other or by themselves. There was a question in my third and last exam about these cosines and tangents in a highly square-rooted condition, which must have been decisive upon the whole of my afterlife. Luckily, I had seen its ugly face only a few days before and recognized it at first sight. I've never met any of these creatures since. My second excerpt occurs as Churchill passes out of the Royal Military Academy and into the world. And it's about horses. And let me qualify that it's a bit grating on modern ears because he spoke of sons, not daughters. Let us not be generational chauvinists. As William Manchester said, Churchill was a Victorian. But he did learn. He came around to women's suffrage, for example, observing the heroic role women had played in World War I. And as his daughter told me, when he realized how many women would vote for him. And he did capture the women's vote in every election after that. So here it is. Here I say to parents, especially wealthy parents, don't give your son money. As far as you can afford it, give him horses. No hour of life is lost. that is spent in the saddle. Young men have often been ruined through owning horses or through backing horses. Did I skip a thing? Let's see. Yeah, there he is. Or through backing horses, but never through riding them. Unless, of course, they break their necks, which, taken at a gallop, is a very good death to die. With the help of his mother and other influential friends, our author won early assignments as a war reporter. He had written 5 books by age 25, 4 of them based on his experiences in Queen Victoria's Little Wars. His grandest early work, which Hillsdale's Paul Ray compares to that of Thucydides, is The River War, published 115 years ago, but soon we hope to be reissued in a masterful new annotated edition by Professor James Muller. Watch for it on our website. You won't want to miss it. The River War is Churchill's brilliant history of British involvement in Muslim tribal wars. It remains insightful to our own time. Combined with stirring personal adventures, these are passages of deep reflection of how enlightened democratic governments deal with primitive or religious tyranny. Remarkably, Professor Ray said this 20 years ago at the Wilson Center at a conference I was at. Quote, "In an age when we are likely to be called on to respond to ugly little conflicts marked by social, sectarian, and tribal rivalries in odd corners of the world, the Arabian Peninsula, the Caucasus, the Horn of Africa, the Balkans, Central Africa, the Maghreb, I can think of no historical work that better deserves our attention," unquote. Far from accepting uncritically the superiority of European civilization, the River War appreciates the longing for freedom among the indigenous Sudanese. But Churchill finds their regime defective in its inadequate protections of human liberty. In 1885, the Sudan had been overrun by dervish tribesmen under their religious leader, the Mahdi, culminating in the assassination of the British envoy, General Gordon, at the capital of Khartoum. 14 years later, London sent General Kitchener and a combined British-Egyptian force, including Churchill, to reestablish Anglo-Egyptian sovereignty. Notwithstanding British-Egyptian weaponry and valor, the obstacles presented by the Nile, the desert, the climate, cholera, and a brave fanatical enemy were formidable. Churchill, of course, celebrates Kitchener's victory, but he doesn't hesitate to criticize the barbaric actions of his army. The desecration of the Mahdi's tomb, the disdain for the fallen foe after the Battle of Omdurman. My favorite passage from the original is Churchill's visit to the battlefield 3 days after British artillery had done its terrible work. And consider how strange this must have sounded to Victorians at the zenith of the British Empire. If you want to know what war can be, even today, with precision-guided drones and smart bombs, you have only to read this description. Quote, "The sight was appalling. The smell redoubled the horror. I've tried to gild war and to solace myself for the loss of dear and gallant friends with the thought that the soldier's death for a cause that he believes in will count for much, whatever may be beyond this world. But there was nothing dulce et decorum about the dervish dead, nothing of the dignity of unconquerable manhood. All was filthy corruption." Churchill asserts his characteristic magnanimity as he and a companion stopped to give comfort to the helpless dying enemy a few days after the battle. Many an English reader was shocked when Churchill declared, "These were as brave men as ever walked the earth." The conviction was borne in on me that their claim beyond the grave in respect of a valiant death was not less good than that which any of our countrymen could make. He adds a note of fatalism. Their end, however, only anticipates that of the victors, for time, which laughs at science as science laughs at valor, will in due course contemptuously brush both combatants away. The world crisis. In 1923 through 31, Churchill published The World Crisis, his memoir of World War I, when he began as First Lord of the Admiralty, fell disastrously from power, commanded a battalion in Flanders, returned to the government as Minister of Munitions, and attended the Versailles Peace Conference. Asked to recommend a big book by Churchill, I always cite The World Crisis. Like all his war books, it's highly personal. One of his friends called it Winston's brilliant autobiography disguised as a history of the universe. And one of his enemies said, Winston has written an enormous book all about himself, and he calls it The World Crisis. Even if you don't read war books, you'll be absorbed by Churchill's account of the awful unfolding events, the international rivalries that caused the Great War, his failed effort to break the deadlock in Europe by forcing the Dardanelles, knocking Turkey out of the war, and aiding the Russians, the carnage on the Western Front, how Germany almost won and then lost the war in 1918. One of his critics, Robert Rhodes James, regarded the world crisis as Churchill's masterpiece, noting that one can never quite separate Churchill the orator from Churchill the writer. His fourth volume, The Aftermath, chronicles the 10 years after victory, including the Versailles Settlement, the Irish Treaty, the Cairo Conference in 1921, which settled the boundaries that we live with in the Middle East today. Churchill pushed hard at Cairo for a Kurdish homeland to protect the Kurds, as he said, against some future bully in Iraq. The Foreign Office overruled him, saying that, of course, Iraq would never be a problem to the West. My first excerpt from The World Crisis is the favorite of General Colin Powell, who asked me for the attribution. Churchill's admonition never to go to war unless your interests are directly involved or you have overwhelming superiority, advice always worth pondering. In 1911, Kaiser Wilhelm sent a gunboat to Agadir, French Morocco, and France almost went to war with Germany over it. Churchill was describing the exchange of telegrams that flew between Berlin, Paris, and London as the Agadir crisis deepened. Can I have my napkin, please? Apologize for my cold. They sound very cautious and correct, these deadly words. Soft, quiet voices, purring, courteous, grave, exactly measured phrases in large, peaceful rooms. But with less warning, cannons had opened fire, and nations had been struck down by this same Germany. So now the Admiralty wireless whispers through the ether to the tall masts of ships, and captains pace their decks, absorbed in thought. It is nothing. It is less than nothing. It is too foolish, too fantastic to be thought of in the 20th century. No one would do such things. Civilization has climbed above such perils. The interdependence of nations in trade and traffic, the sense of public law, the Hague Convention, liberal principles, the Labor Party, high finance, Christian charity, common sense have rendered such nightmares impossible. Are you quite sure? It would be a pity to be wrong. Such a mistake can only be made once for all. Of course, the mistakes were made. The world plunged into war 3 years later, and Churchill mobilized the Navy. And here he describes the fateful cabinet meeting of July 24th, 1914, a month after a Serbian nationalist had murdered the Archduke Francis Ferdinand of Austria. The cabinet on Friday afternoon had sat long revolving the Irish problem. The discussion turned principally upon the boundaries of Fermanagh and Tyrone, upon the disposition of these clusters of humble parishes, turned at that moment the political future of Great Britain. Turning this way and that in search of an exit from the deadlock, the cabinet toiled around the muddy byways of Fermanagh and Tyrone. The discussion had reached its inconclusive end, and the cabinet was about to separate when the quiet, grave tones of Sir Edward Grey's voice were heard, reading a document which had just been brought to him from the Foreign Office. It was the Austrian note to Serbia. He had been reading or speaking for several minutes before I could disengage my mind from the tedious and bewildering debate which had just been closed. This note was clearly an ultimatum, such as had never been penned in modern times. It seemed absolutely impossible that any state in the world could accept it, or that any acceptance, however abject, would satisfy the aggressor. The parishes of Fermanagh and Tyrone faded back into the mists and squalls of Ireland, and a strange light began immediately, but by perceptible gradations, to fall and grow upon the map of Europe. With his great capacity for recall, Churchill harked back to that exact moment 8 years later in 1922 when he was introducing the Irish Free State Bill to Parliament. The Irish quarrel, he said, had been interrupted by the Great War. Every institution almost in the world was strained. Great empires have been overturned. The whole map of Europe has been changed. The position of countries has been violently altered. The modes and thought of men, the whole outlook on affairs, the grouping of parties, all have encountered violent and tremendous changes in the deluge which has struck the world. But as that deluge subsides and the waters fall short, we see the dreary steeples of Fermanagh and Tyrone emerging once again. The integrity of their quarrel is one of the few institutions that has been unaltered in the cataclysm which has swept the world. A few years later, he reflected on those times to Lord Beaverbrook. Unteachable from infancy to tomb, there is the first and main characteristic of mankind. And Churchill sadly shook his head. Perhaps we should too. From early 1929, when the Conservatives lost the general election, to late 1939, when he returned as head of the Admiralty, Churchill was in the political wilderness, isolated by his opposition to the India Bill and his demands that Britain rearm in the face of Hitler. He was not a politician who takes the public pulse and engages in popularity contests. He never hesitated to tell people things they didn't want to hear. And until his warnings were proved all too real, he took the heat for unpopular views. Yet this decade was no wilderness for Churchill the writer. I lived mainly at Chartwell, he recalled, where I had much to amuse me. Always in need of money, he worked late into the night, laboring on hundreds of articles and some of his most compelling books, including his great biography, The Life of His Ancestor, John Churchill, first Duke of Marlborough. No less a scholar than Leo Strauss called Marlborough the greatest historical work written in our century, an inexhaustible mine of political wisdom and understanding which should be required reading for every student of political science. I'm reading it right now on Kindle. It's amazing. Some of our presidential candidates should read it. It provides very good advice about getting out of tight spots. Maurice Ashley, Churchill's leading assistant on Marlborough, wrote that his boss held courage and honor as leading virtues, which could at times eclipse other considerations. That is Churchill's main weakness as a historical writer, he said. History had first been a pleasant method of making money, and in the end it was a means of self-justification. But, Ashley continues, there is no doubt whatever that Churchill possessed a powerful sense of history. As Isaiah Berlin has written, Churchill's central organizing principle was an historical imagination so strong, so comprehensive, as to encase the whole of the future in a framework of a rich and multicolored past. A piece which summarizes their view is Churchill's 1930 article, If Lee Had Not Won the Battle of Gettysburg. As if seated around a dinner table, Churchill reminds us, of course, that everyone knows Lee occupied Little Round Top in time to forestall a flanking movement by the Union left, and Confederate guns clear the field on the fatal day. Pickett's charge smashes the Federal line, and General Meade falls back into Maryland. Lincoln and his government, seeing ruin approach, flee to New York. The Army of Northern Virginia occupies Washington, and the world's only superpower, Great Britain, recognizes the Confederacy. Then Lee, in his hour of victory, supplants Jefferson Davis as the moral leader of the Southern nation. And Churchill writes, if Lee had been merely a soldier, his achievements would have ended on the battlefield. It was his August declaration that the victorious Confederacy would pursue no policy toward the slaves, which was not in harmony with the moral conceptions of Western Europe, that opened the high roads along which we are now marching so prosperously. This was in 1930. So Lee, you see, frees the slaves. We all knew that he hated slavery. Lincoln then declares that the moral issue separating the states no longer exists, and at the Treaty of Harper's Ferry in September 1863, the United States recognizes that the South is independent and the slaves are free. The USA and the CSA live uneasily side by side, both armed to the teeth, through 1914, when war threatens Europe. They then join with Great Britain to form the English-Speaking Association, whose combined power and influence is so great that it forestalls war. The ESA forces a general disarmament and the establishment of constitutional monarchies in Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary. But notice how this tale melds together Churchill's deeply held beliefs: Anglo-American unity, peace through strength, sovereigns who reign but don't rule. Churchill then suggests what might have happened if Lee had lost. The defeated South, he says, would have smoldered in resentment, enacting laws to compromise the rights of freedmen. Armies of carpetbaggers might have descended to take advantage of them. America, though united, might have developed a national psyche unwilling to involve herself in European quarrels. A war in 1914 would almost certainly have meant the ruin of Russia and Germany, perhaps even Bolshevik and fascist takeovers. Churchill concludes in his imagined present, 1930, whether the Emperor Wilhelm II will be successful in carrying the project of European unity forward by another important stage at the forthcoming Pan-European Conference in Berlin is still a matter of prophecy. But let him not forget that he might well have found himself eating the bitter bread of exile, a dethroned sovereign and a broken man loaded with unutterable reproach. And this, we repeat, might well have been his fate if Lee had not won the Battle of Gettysburg. So think of it, a European Union in 1930, no Lenin, no Hitler, no Mussolini. Truly, Winston Churchill was a graduate optimist. In the last few years of his life, Churchill gave in to the pessimism he had always dodged before, and despite reports, he was never much bothered by depression until very old age. His private secretary, Anthony Montague Brown, often dined with him alone, trying to keep his spirits up by reminding him of all that he had accomplished. Yes, Churchill would say, I have worked very hard and accomplished a great many things, only to accomplish nothing in the end. I speculated, and Anthony agreed, that Sir Winston referred to his failure to cement the special relationship with America, which wavered after the Suez Crisis and never developed as he wished, and to reach what he called a final settlement with the Soviets, although in 1949 he predicted that communism would one day expire in the blink of an eye. He also was saddened, Anthony added, that his father had not lived to see what he had accomplished. At dinner one evening in 1946, his daughter Sarah pointed to an empty chair. If you had the power to put someone in that chair, whom would you choose? She expected him to say Caesar, Napoleon, Marlborough, but he quickly replied, oh, my father, of course. Churchill then went on to write what he called a private article, never published in his lifetime, about a winter night in his studio where he's attempting to copy a portrait of his father. He's just giving a twirl to the mustache when he feels an odd sensation, and there, sitting in his red leather armchair, is Lord Randolph Churchill, with flashing blue eyes and a cigarette holder poised, just as Winston remembered him in his prime. What are you doing, Winston? His father says. Winston explains he's painting. I only do it as a hobby. Yes, I'm sure you never could earn your living that way, his father observes. How do you get your living? And Winston replies, I write books and articles for the press. Unimpressed, Lord Randolph asks what year it is. 1947, Winston says. So more than 50 years have passed, says his father. A lot must have happened. Tell me about it. So Winston, aged 73, recites to his 40-year-old father everything that has happened since Lord Randolph died in 1895, without ever revealing, and this is the great irony and charm of the piece, the roles Winston himself played. He shocks his father by informing him that women have the vote, the socialists are in power, Burma is independent, and India has gone down the drain. His father groans. What about Ireland? Did they get home rule? The South got it, but Ulster stayed with us. Are the South a republic? No one knows what they are, Papa. They are neither in nor out of the empire. Winston mentions that there have been wars. Lord Randolph looks up with a start. War, did you say? Yes, indeed, Papa. We've had nothing else but war since democracy took charge. Did we win? Yes, we won all our wars. All our enemies were beaten down. But wars like these must have cost 1 million lives. Papa, in each of them, about 30 million men were killed in battle. In the last one, 7 million were murdered in cold blood, mainly by the Germans. They made human slaughter pens like the Chicago stockyards. Europe is a ruin. 10 capitals in Eastern Europe are in Russian hands. They are communists now, you know, Karl Marx and all that. It may well be that an even worse war is drawing near. Far gone are the days of Queen Victoria and a settled world order. Lord Randolph is stunned. Winston, he says, you told me a terrible tale. I would have never believed that such things could happen. I'm glad I did not live to see them. As I listen to you unfolding these fearful facts, you seem to know a great deal about them. I never expected you would develop so far and so fully. Of course, you are too old now to think about such things, but when I hear you talk, I really wonder you didn't go into politics. You might have done a bit to help. You might even have made a name for yourself. His father strikes a match to light his cigarette. There's a tiny flash, and he vanishes, and the chair is empty. And Winston writes, I rubbed my brush again in my paint and turned to finish the mustache, but so vivid had my fancy been that I felt too tired to go on. Also, my cigar had gone out, and the ash had fallen among the paints. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions. If you'd raise your hand and please stand when the microphone is brought to you. He's told it all.
Got some.
Oh, we have one back here.
Got some.
Good afternoon, Richard.
Hi, Randy.
Churchill wrote a piece entitled 50 Years Hence. What could you tell us about it?
He predicted cell phones 50 years hence. He wrote it, when was that, 1932, 33? He predicted an age of mass communication and greatly feared it. 24/7 news media that knows everything and nothing all at the same time. Instant reporting of news, stuff we hear when we turn on the television every night. He also said that in 50 years we'll be able to grow only the parts of the chicken such as we had for lunch. We don't have to worry about the legs or the tail, just the bits we need. So some of it was a little far out, but some of it was very much on the mark. And he greatly feared that advent of mass media, an age when you don't have time to contemplate what you're going to say. And before you say, you better be advised by a dozen different pollsters to tell you what not to say, or what would not go well down in the Iowa primary. Yes.
In the early 30s.
Yeah. Of course,
And he talked about how fast things were going to move. And
yeah.
be prepared for it.
He regretted it very much. He said at Harvard, speaking at Harvard in 1943, he said, "Man has parted company with his faithful friend the horse, and has sailed forth on the azure on the wings of eagles." Eagles being represented by the internal combustion engine. Even elderly parliamentarians like myself are forced to acquire a high degree of mobility. Yeah, but that was his fear in the 30s. And the essay 50 Years Hence is in Thoughts and Adventures, which is a fine edition of which is out by the ISI Press. You can get it from Amazon, edited by Jim Muller, with lots of good footnotes. And it's worth reading along with all the other essays in there, including the one on Hitler, by the way, which Jim doesn't think belongs there because it's so out of touch with great men. You know, Churchill said that when asked to compare Napoleon with Hitler, he said, "I refuse to disparage the dead." And it's repugnant to me to compare the great emperor of the French with a squalid caucus boss and butcher. Any other questions?
Professor, we've heard
I'm not a professor.
myths been debunked this week. Have there been any, or thought of, a scholarly tone to answer some of the misconceptions and myths about Churchill, putting it into appropriate direction?
Well, we have a section on our website called Truths and Heresies. The Churchill Center has one called Leading Churchill Myths. I wrote lots of those. We try to refer people to it all the time. We write stiff letters to Forbes when they say silly things about the Dardanelles and Gallipoli. Most people can't seem to distinguish between the two. They were two separate operations. Lord Mountbatten, who was in charge of combined operations in the Second World War, said that if they had combined operations in 1915, they might have pulled that one off. The Dardanelles and Gallipoli, of course, they didn't, and they were very, very much disjointed in their approach, the military versus the Navy. But those are two things you can do. The web gives you maximum access to everyone in the world. It's just a question of getting them to find you, you know. Yes. One over here, someone?
Yes, sir. Could you speak to the Fulton, Missouri trip and the Excerpt speech and the relationship with Eric Truman?
Do you mean the fun they had on the way down?
Yes.
Well, the first thing Truman decided to do was to offer the prime minister, he was the leader of the opposition, 1946, a glass of whiskey. And so he poured it, and Truman spoke with a bright, sprightly, brief, staccato air. And they had gotten to the point where they were calling each other Winston and Harry. And so he said, "Well, Winston, what do you think of the whiskey?" And Churchill looked at him and said, "My dear my dear Harry, this is not whiskey. It's very good. It's not whiskey. It's bourbon." And the train stops in the middle of the suburbs of Maryland while someone is sent off to run to an all-night liquor store and get a bottle of scotch. And then after dinner, they decided to play poker. They said, "Winston, have you ever played poker?" "Oh, yes." He said, "I learned poker in the Boer War." And Clark Clifford, who was the president's assistant, wrote about this later in Reader's Digest, and I also interviewed him about it. And he said, "We thought the Boer War was fantastic. None of us ever knew when the Boer War was. 50 years before, you know." So they decided to play poker. Now, the president's poker team, his staff, were pretty crack poker players. And after a few rounds, it became obvious that Winston wasn't up to their standard, and he'd lost a bundle of money, about $200. So at that point, he excused himself and went to the gents. And the president's press secretary, Charlie Ross, they spoke with less formality in those days, said to the president, "Well, boss, what do you think of his playing? It's pretty grim, isn't it?" And Truman said, "Well, boys, it's obvious that the standards of poker in Great Britain are not up to the standards here in the United States." And Charlie Ross said, "Boss, do you want us to play poker, or do you want us to carry this fellow?" And Truman said, "Well, he is our guest. We should treat him as a guest and try to make him feel like he hasn't been a total disaster in this poker round." So for the rest of the trip, Clark Clifford said, "I saw guys drop out with 3 aces, full houses, flushes." And at the end, Churchill was $50 ahead and thought he'd acquitted himself very well on behalf of Great Britain. Truman, of course, also read the Iron Curtain speech, the Sinews of Peace speech, which he later denied having read in advance. On the way down, said he thought it would go down very well. It certainly did. It went down like a clanging bell. And Churchill and Truman were both greatly criticized for that afterward. But Truman was trying to maintain plausible deniability, you know, just like we do about emails.
We have time for one more question.
Boer War was next. I'm of Dutch ancestry, and I learned a little bit about it, and the British didn't come out too well. few words how British justified the Boer War in South Africa?
The Boer War in South Africa.
If that's possible.
Yes, well, of course, they only controlled part of South Africa then when the Boer War broke out. It was the second one that they had two fights. Natal and Orange River Colony and Transvaal were Dutch. Natal and what was the other province? Who knows? Someone knows. Cape Colony were British. And what happened was that the Boers, who were in the majority, wanted to legislate the whole country, and that's when the war broke out. Churchill, as usual, was tremendously magnanimous towards the Boers, and went on a lecture tour in 1901 where he went all around the country facing mainly hostile audiences. We weren't big on imperialist Britain. And he would show magic lantern slides, like we did with our magic lantern here. And at one point he showed the slide of a Boer horseman mounted on his horse with his rifle. And the audience broke into cheers for the enemy. And Churchill said, "You are right to applaud him. He's one of the greatest fighting men you'll ever see." And then after that, in 1906, when he was Under Secretary of State for the Colonies, he helped arrange the Transvaal peace, the Peace Pact, which led to the Union of South Africa. And he met Louis Botha, who later claimed that he captured him personally, but that wasn't true. It's one of Botha's lieutenants. I think Botha led the column that captured Churchill, who was a war correspondent. But they became fast friends, and Botha was the guy who really, he was the Desmond Morton of 1914, telling Churchill what the Germans were really up to, and that Churchill at that time was First Lord of the Admiralty, and he said you should make sure that the Navy is ready because you're coming into a war. So his friendships there were very great. His greatest friend was Jan Christian Smuts, the great South African prime minister, who actually campaigned and lost on ending apartheid in 1949. So he fought for Britain, but he understood the Boers' aspirations and tried to accommodate them with the Transvaal Constitution. That answer your question?
Thank you, Richard Langworth.
Thank you.